My name is Amy Rivers, and my latest book is Stumble and Fall, which is the second book in a series, A Legacy of Silence. It's a book about domestic human trafficking and takes place in a small town in New Mexico, which is actually my hometown, and sort of looks at the relationship of two sisters, both their familial relationship and then how the things that are being uncovered in town are impacting them. Human trafficking element of the story has to do a lot with the way in which small towns can sometimes hide or become somewhat complicit in the actual execution of a crime or the covering up of a crime. And so the thriller part of this book has to do with that. I like to look at relationships, and so the sister relationship is a particularly interesting one to me, probably because I have a sister and we have a really interesting relationship. So as soon as I started envisioning writing a book series that had to do with domestic trafficking, I knew that it was going to take a little while to get through the story, especially one that has been ingrained in the community for generations. I think that it's nice sometimes to be able to wrap up a mystery very quickly, but in cases, especially that have to do with very real social issues like human trafficking, it's complicated. It's complicated both by the situation and who's involved in it and who has been covering up, and also just by the psychology of the people who are involved. Victims act differently, and people who are involved in perpetuating this criminal enterprise are going to have different relationships to it and different relationships to one another. And so trying to wrap all of that up in one book seemed a little bit impossible. So when I started envisioning it, it was always as a 3-book series. And that's pretty much what it looks like it's going to be. I did for a few minutes think about expanding that, but I think by the time that we get done with book 3, I think the readers are going to be ready to take a little bit of a breath. I worked for many years as the director for a sexual assault nurse examiners program in a rural area. So we actually covered several jurisdictions and worked with local law enforcement, with tribal government and the military and the prison system. And so my training and then also my education in psychology and political science informed a lot of what I write about. I'm very interested in looking at victim behavior and criminal behavior. Human behavior and motivation is very interesting to me, and so um, I always wanted to be able to look at how those things impact a situation in a very real and authentic sense. So I spend a lot of time paying attention to what are the psychological underpinnings of my characters and uh, how the actual elements of the cases are being portrayed in as authentic a way as possible, which is all sort of goes back to the training and education that I had, especially working in that job. For me, a good thriller has to be absolutely packed from end to end with suspense and tension. I think that it makes a difference what type of thriller that you're reading as to whether it needs to be very fast paced and action packed or whether it can be more of a slow burn. And for me, psychological thriller is sort of my favorite. So that slow burn where you get to know the characters and you get to see their flaws and their vulnerability and all of the things that go into the situation that is then presented in the book is really satisfying. But I think that if you don't have tension and you don't have suspense and you don't have those things really just absolutely end to end, the reader is going to lose interest. The reader is going to, uh, lose engagement in the story that is being told. So regardless of whether there's mystery or romance or any other elements, I think that those things must exist for a thriller to be really good. It was. I started writing women's fiction with a focus really on how women, real women, how they are impacted by the things that happen to them, what kind of societal expectations are put on them, and how that informs what they do in their lives. And so I started out not really looking on the crime side of things, but certainly looking at real life issues, especially for women. And then as I moved into crime fiction, it became really important to me to look at some of the issues that we don't necessarily want to talk about all of the time, like interpersonal violence and trafficking and sexual assault and child abuse, and things that are heavy topics. They're hard to think about, but sometimes we need to have some perspective on those things. And it can be fairly depressing to watch the news, to read books about, true stories that happen. And it occurred to me that fiction is actually a really wonderful lens for dealing with some of those very heavy social issues. You go into a fictional book knowing that you're going to be entertained, so you put down your guard a little bit in terms of what your expectations are as a reader. And I think it's a really great venue for authors to be able to talk about the realities of human behavior and of the way that relationships work and how crime impacts people, real people in the real world, in a way that makes it more palatable and a little bit easier to take for the people who are reading. Kate and Tilly will be back for book 3 of this series later this year in the fall of 2023. The next book will wrap up the domestic trafficking issues. Of course, as with all things real life, there's more to the story, and whether or not Kate and Tilly will make another appearance someday in the future is something that I still am thinking about and mulling around. But there will be a lot of resolution, I think, in this next book about how the sisters are going to move forward in their lives and how the whole town is going to both acknowledge and recover from what has been happening right under their noses. So I think this book is for an audience that enjoys psychological fiction, whether it be crime fiction or women's fiction, something that really looks at the behaviors of and motivations of the people who are actually involved. I'm a very character driven writer, and so that really, I think, has to be essentially what a person wants to get into when they're reading my books. I think that fans of Karen Slaughter, Lisa Gardner, some of the really big names out there in psychological fiction right now, psychological crime fiction, who are tackling some of these really big issues will enjoy these books.